Listen to that sound. It's the sound of hope, of community, of a tradition carried across borders and generations, echoing right in the heart of London. It is the sound of the London Welsh Male Voice Choir in 1938. But what they didn't know, what no one could have truly known, was that this was the sound of a final bow. For many of these men, this was the last year they would ever sing together. Their voices, once the toast of London, were about to be silenced by the drums of war. This isn't just the story of a choir, it's the story of a world on the brink, of a community bound by song, and of the individual voices that were lost in the cataclysm of history. This is the story of the silent choir and the voices that never sang again. To understand the London Welsh Male Voice Choir of 1938, you have to understand London itself. In the late 1930s, London was a city of ghosts and omens. The heart of a vast empire, a metropolis of over 8 million souls, it still bore the scars of the last Great War. Men walked the streets who remembered the mud of the Somme, who had seen a generation of their friends simply vanish. Now, new shadows were stretching across Europe. But in the grand theatre of daily life, the show went on. Theatres glowed, dance halls swayed, and in bustling Welsh chapels and community halls, men gathered to sing. For the tens of thousands of Welsh people who'd migrated to London, the city was a place of stark contrasts. It offered opportunities that the depressed coalfields and farms of their homeland could not, but it was also a place of profound loneliness, a sprawling, indifferent giant. The Welsh have a word for this feeling: Heareth. It's a deep, yearning nostalgia for a home you can't return to, a blend of homesickness, grief, and longing. The antidote to Hiraeth, for so many, was community, and the heart of that community was music. Since the 19th century, Welsh migrants had founded chapels, societies, and clubs all across London. They were dairymen, drapers, and builders by day, but on rehearsal nights, they were something more. They were keepers of a sacred flame. Wales is often called the land of song, and the male voice choir is its national instrument. It's a tradition forged in the hardship of the mines and the piety of the chapel, a sound that is at once overwhelmingly powerful and deeply vulnerable. The London Welsh Male Voice Choir, first formed back in 1902, was a pillar of this expatriate culture. It had seen triumphs and fallow periods, winning acclaim in Paris before the First World War, then disbanding as its members went to fight. It reformed, struggled through the Depression, and by 1938 was entering a new golden era. Part of this energy came from dynamic musical leadership, including men like Kenneth Thomas, a conductor who began working with the choir at concerts around this time. He was one of the figures who took the raw, passionate sound of the choir and began to refine it, to polish it until it shone. A photograph from this era shows a rehearsal in full swing at the Charing Cross Welsh Chapel. Look at the faces. These weren't professional singers. They were ordinary men who, when they came together, created something extraordinary. You can just imagine them. Men like Bryn, a baritone, a milkman rising before the city stirred, his hands chapped from the cold. In the choir, his voice was warm and steady, the bedrock of their sound. Or picture David, a young tenor working as a draper's assistant on Oxford Street, his head full of the latest tunes and the anxieties of a young man making his way in the world. And then there were men like Evan, one of the older members, a veteran of the First War who rarely spoke of it, but who sang with a ferocious, heart-breaking passion, as if to drown out the echoes of the past. Their rehearsal space, be it the Grand London Welsh Centre or a humble chapel vestry, was a sanctuary. It was a place where the cacophony of London, the rumble of the tube, the cries of newsboys shouting headlines about faraway places like Austria and Czechoslovakia, all faded away. For a few hours a week, all that mattered was the blend of voices, the rise and fall of the melody, the shared breath and the perfect harmony. In 1938, as they celebrated St. David's Day with a concert at the Welsh Guards headquarters, their sound was bigger and more confident than ever. They were a tight-knit band of brothers, singing as if they had all the time in the world. For any Welsh choir, the ultimate test, the pinnacle of achievement, is to perform at the National Eisteddfod. Held annually, this grand festival of Welsh culture is like the Olympic Games, a literary awards ceremony, and a massive musical competition all rolled into one. To take the stage, there is to prove your worth in the land of song. In August of 1939, the Eisteddfod was held in the historic town of Denbigh in North Wales. For the London Welsh Male Voice Choir, this was their ambitious goal. It would be a pilgrimage, a return to the homeland, not just as sons, but as peers. The year leading up to it was a crescendo of relentless practice. 1938 had been a good year, a year of building their repertoire and their reputation beyond the Welsh community. They weren't just the London Welsh Choir anymore, they were becoming a London choir, a voice for the city itself. But the Eisteddfod was different. Competing there meant going up against choirs from the Welsh heartland, men who had been singing together since they were boys, whose sound was steeped in the very landscape of the valleys. The journey to Denbigh was part of the ritual. Imagine trains packed with men in their Sunday best, the air thick with anticipation. For men like Bryn the milkman, David the draper, and Evan the veteran, this was more than a competition. It was a chance to show the families and communities they'd left behind what they had become, to prove their Welshness hadn't been diluted by the London fog. The competition was held in the Maes, the main field, inside a vast wooden pavilion that vibrated with the energy of thousands of spectators. The air was electric. One by one the choirs took the stage. The Rhondda Gleeman, the Treorchy Male Choir, legends of the choral world. Each performance was a tidal wave of sound. Backstage, the London men listened, their confidence warring with their nerves. They were the exiles, the city boys. Then, it was their turn. They filed onto the stage, 100 men in dark suits. Kenneth Thomas, who conducted them for the event, strode to the front, gave a nod, and a hush fell. He raised his hands. They sang of mountains and valleys, of loss and of heaven. They poured all their hiraeth, their collective yearning for the home they had left, into the music. Evan, the quiet veteran, closed his eyes, his voice joining a chorus that seemed to transcend the pavilion and roll out across the Welsh hills. They showed their technical skill, the discipline their conductors had instilled in them. They weren't just singing notes, they were telling their story, the story of a community holding fast to its identity in a foreign land. When the final chord faded, there was a moment of absolute silence. Then the pavilion erupted. The applause was a roar of approval, of recognition. The stern-faced judges were visibly moved. The London Welsh had travelled home and proven themselves on the greatest stage in Wales. As they celebrated that evening, the taste of their powerful performance still sweet. The world outside the Eisteddfod grounds seemed a distant problem. They felt like champions. Their future seemed limitless. They made plans for grand concerts in London, for building on this incredible momentum. The performance at Denbigh in August 1939 was not a beginning. It felt like a glorious climax. But it was, in fact, a prelude, the final, beautiful note before an abrupt and terrible silence. Returning to London from the Eisteddfod was like returning from another world. The choir was euphoric, buoyed by the pride of having held their own against the very best. Their powerful showing sent a shockwave of pride through the London Welsh community. Suddenly, the London Welsh Centre on Gray's Inn Road was the place to be. Rehearsals, once attended only by the dedicated, now drew spectators. Their upcoming concerts were selling out. The autumn of 1938 and the spring and summer of 1939 became a whirlwind of activity. A performance at the Queen's Hall was met with a standing ovation. They sang at charity events, at formal dinners, and back in the comforting familiarity of the Welsh chapels that dotted the city. During this time, the choir became a microcosm of the city itself, vibrant, defiant, and determinedly carrying on with life. But while the choir sang its songs of hope, the world was humming a different, more menacing tune. The rising action of the choir's success was tragically mirrored by the rising action of the impending war. The two narratives ran in parallel, a chilling duet of hope and dread. In September 1938, as the choir was celebrating a local concert success, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned from Munich promising peace for our time. There was a collective sigh of relief, but for men like Evan, who had seen war firsthand, the relief was short-lived. The whispers of war never truly went away. Life in London began to change. In September 1938, Londoners were issued their first gas masks in flimsy cardboard boxes. Trenches were being dug in the city's parks. Air raid precautions, or ARP, wardens were being recruited. These developments infiltrated the choir's sanctuary. A rehearsal might be interrupted by the wail of a practice air raid siren. A conversation between songs would turn from music to the news from Czechoslovakia in March 1939. Each event was another drumbeat in a steady, ominous rhythm. The government posters appearing on billboards were a constant, nagging reminder. Your courage, your cheerfulness, your resolution will bring us victory. It was a call to a battle that hadn't officially begun, but which everyone felt was coming. Conductors like Kenneth Thomas tried to keep the outside world at bay. "Leave your troubles at the door," they'd command. "Here, there is only the music." And for a few hours, it worked. When they sang, they could almost believe that their harmony could hold back the chaos. Their music became more than just an art form. It was an act of defiance. They poured their anxieties into the songs, and the music became richer, more poignant, more desperate. The peak of their pre-war journey was that trip to Denby in August 1939. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. For one glorious week, they allowed themselves to believe in the bright future they were planning. They returned to London ready to begin their next chapter, but the duet was reaching its terrible final chord. On the 1st of September 1939, as the choir members went about their daily jobs, the news broke. Germany had invaded Poland. The whispers had become a roar. The rising action was over. The climax was at hand. What was their last concert? It was never meant to be the last. Perhaps it was a grand performance scheduled for that very weekend, meant to be a victory celebration for the Eisteddfod veterans. Imagine a venue like Central Hall, Westminster, a grand, domed hall just a stone's throw from the Houses of Parliament. The atmosphere on Saturday, September the 2nd, 1939, would have been nothing like they had imagined just weeks before. On Friday, Britain had issued its ultimatum to Hitler: withdraw from Poland, or a state of war will exist between us. The deadline was 11 a.m. on Sunday. London was in a state of controlled panic. The evacuation had begun. 1.5 million people, mostly children, were moved out of the city. Train stations were scenes of organized chaos and quiet heartbreak. Barrage balloons like silent silver elephants were floated high above the rooftops. Sandbags were piled high against buildings. That night, the first citywide blackout was initiated, plunging London into an eerie, unfamiliar darkness. Against this backdrop, the question must have arisen: should we even sing? It might have seemed frivolous, but you can imagine a determined conductor insisting, "We will sing. Now more than ever, people need this. We will sing because it is what we do." And so, on that evening, the 100 men of the London Welsh Male Voice Choir would have made their way through the darkened, tense streets. Backstage, the mood must have been a strange cocktail of pride, anxiety, and profound sadness. They weren't just singers anymore. They were fathers whose children were gone, sons whose mothers were terrified. They were men who knew, with dreadful certainty, that their lives were about to change forever. A young tenor like David, just 20 years old, would have looked pale. A veteran like Evan would have been grimly quiet. When they walked on stage, the applause would have been heavy with emotion. The faces in the hall etched with worry. They saw their wives, their families. Their conductor would have simply looked at his men, a long, searching look that said everything. He'd raise his hands, and the concert would begin. They might have opened with Men of Harlech, the defiant martial anthem. The song, sung countless times, would have taken on a powerful new meaning. It was no longer a historical ballad, it was a present-day declaration. The sound filling the hall would have been immense, the sound of 100 men staring into the abyss and singing with all their might. The emotional heart of the evening might have been a hymn like Gwahoddiad, which translates to invitation, a gentle, pleading melody that speaks of coming home, of finding peace. As they sang, a profound stillness would have settled over the hall. In that moment, they would have been one community, sharing a single fragile moment of peace. For their final number, they would sing the Welsh national anthem, Hen Vlad fi Nadaw, Land of My Fathers. As the first notes were sung, the entire audience would rise. And then, something remarkable might have happened. The audience would begin to sing with them. In that grand hall, just hours before war, 2,000 voices, Welsh and English, joining as one. A sound of incredible power and heartbreaking beauty, a lament, a prayer, and a promise to endure. When the last echo faded, there would be no applause, only a deep, shared silence. The conductor would lower his arms, he would turn, bow, and lead his men off the stage. No encores. There was nothing more to say. It was the greatest performance they had ever given, and for many of them, it was the last performance they would ever give. They were no longer a choir, they were soldiers in waiting. The ultimatum expired at 11 a.m. on Sunday, September the 3rd, 1939. At 11:15 a.m., Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's voice crackled over the radio. "This country is at war with Germany." For the men of the choir, the news landed with a thud of finality. The future they had planned had evaporated. An announcement was posted. Due to the national emergency, all choir activities are suspended until further notice. That notice would stand for 7 years. The falling action was swift. The choir, that single entity of 100 voices, was scattered to the winds. Conscription began immediately for men between 18 and 41. The choir was composed almost entirely of men in that demographic. A young man like David, the gifted tenor, would have been one of the first to go, enlisting in the Royal Air Force. You can picture him writing home. Strange, 1 month we're the toast of Wales, the next I'm learning how to tell a Messerschmitt from a Spitfire. Tell the boys I miss the harmonies, but there's a different kind of music here, the roar of a Merlin engine. Not as sweet, but it's the song we have to sing now. A steady baritone like Bryn, a husband and father, would have waited for his call-up papers. Assigned to an anti-aircraft battery in London, his job, once to lay the foundation of a chord, was now to scan the night sky for the bombers that would soon come to tear his city apart. An older veteran like Evan, technically too old for conscription, might have volunteered for the Home Guard, teaching younger men how to handle a rifle, his face set with a grim resolve earned 20 years earlier. Others were scattered even further, to the Navy in the cold Atlantic, to training camps across Britain. The London Welsh Centre on Gray's Inn Road, their home, was transformed. It became a services club for Welsh military personnel. Where the choir had once practiced, now soldiers on leave leapt on cots and wrote letters home. Yet Kenneth Thomas kept a small flame of music alive, conducting communal hymn-singing on Sunday evenings throughout the war, a quiet insistence that their voices would not be entirely extinguished. In September 1940, the Blitz began. The soundscape of London was no longer theatre crowds and choir songs, but the shriek of sirens and the crump of exploding bombs. The faded photograph of the 1939 choir became a relic of a lost world. The faces in it were now pilots, gunners and sailors fighting separate battles. Their unified voice had been broken. The silence had begun. The war in Europe ended on May the 8th, 1945. As the slow, arduous process of rebuilding began, it was time to count the cost. For the community of the London Welsh, it was time to see who was coming home. Slowly, the men of the choir who had survived began to trickle back. They were older, wearier, and profoundly changed. A meeting was called, a reunion, of the 100 men who stood on the stage in 1939. Not all were present. A young man like David, the gifted tenor with the voice of an angel, would never come home. His plane shot down over the English Channel during the Battle of Britain. His voice, which had promised such a brilliant future, was silenced forever. There were others. A baritone lost in the North Atlantic, a bass who fell at El Alamein. In total, more than a dozen of the choir's finest voices were gone. An entire section silenced. They were the silent choir. Those who did return carried their own scars. A veteran like Evan was quieter than ever. A man like Bryn found a quiet joy in the simple act of delivering milk on a peaceful morning. The war had taken its toll. What of the choir itself? The institution, like the city, had survived, but it was wounded. Officially, the choir was disbanded during the war. The momentum of 1939 was gone. For a time, it seemed the great London Welsh male voice choir might become just a memory. But the music hadn't died. The surviving members would meet, talk about the old days, and maybe, in a pub corner, quietly harmonise on an old tune. The Hireth was still there. The need to sing was still there. Finally, in 1961, driven by a new generation and seeded by members of a post-war youth choir, the London Welsh Male Voice Choir was formally re-established. It was a resurrection. They began to rehearse again, their ranks filled with new faces alongside a few grizzled veterans from the class of '39. The sound was different, seasoned with a history of loss and survival. The choir not only reformed, it thrived. It went on to perform around the world, becoming, as it remains today, a vital part of London's cultural landscape. The melody was unbroken. But the story of the silent choir is a story of what was lost. The unique combination of voices, the specific alchemy of that 100-man instrument from 1939, was a fleeting miracle. It could never be perfectly replicated. The voices of the men who never returned left a permanent silence, an unresolved chord in the choir's history. Let's end with that photograph. A faded black and white image of 100 men, frozen in time, 1939. They look so proud, so full of hope. They are the London Welsh Male Voice Choir. For a brief shining moment, their voices filled the grand halls of London, a symbol of community and defiance in a darkening world. A year later, many of those voices were silenced forever. Their story is a testament to the human cost of conflict, a reminder that behind the grand narratives of history are individual lives, individual dreams, and individual songs that were never finished. It reminds us that the fear of being forgotten is a profound human pain, and that by telling these stories, we give a voice back to those who were silenced. The choir sings on today, a living tribute to its own history. But he must never forget the silent ones, the men who sang their final songs on the eve of war and then went off to play their part, leaving behind an echo that can still be heard if you listen closely enough. The story of the London Welsh Male Voice Choir is just one of thousands from a generation that faced unimaginable challenges. If you believe it's important to keep these human stories from history alive, please consider subscribing for more. And if you have a story from your own family's past, share it in the comments below. By sharing, we remember. Thank you for listening.